The book of Acts. We did some of the smaller books in the New Testament because I wanted to cover some of those things in the New Testament that sometimes we neglect to read. Like, when was the last time we read through 2nd and 3rd John and Jude and Philemon? We did all of those, and then we moved into the Old Testament. So our first Old Testament foray has went back here to the book of Esther. I just felt compelled to go there. I felt the Holy Spirit leading me to go there. There's a story there. Because most of the time in our lives as Christians, we can't actually see God working in everything, but we know at some points that God is there. And that is exactly what is happening in this book of Esther. The name of God is not in the book of Esther, but we see God's fingerprints on it. The Old Testament law, the law of Moses, is not in the book of Esther, but we can see the bits and pieces of it sprinkled throughout. What else? In the book of Esther, Esther's cousin Mordecai is a descendant of Benjamin. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. That wasn't where I was going for there, though. But also, we see the bad guy Haman in the book of Esther, and he's a descendant of a man named Agag. So we see in the book of Esther things working together that God is piecing together to let us know He wants us to know about. Last week we covered Esther, where there was a plot to kill the king. Well, do you guys remember how the king found out about the plot? This was a couple of weeks ago. Mordecai. We're not there now, but it's good to remember what happened after the king found out. The king had wrote down exactly what Mordecai had found out. He forgot about Mordecai, though. So Mordecai is still there. He's in the gate. And then there was a man that says the king promoted Haman, right? Haman was an Agagite. And all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 15, we see that God had told King Saul to take out all of the Amalekites. Now, the Amalekite king was King Agag, and Saul did not take out King Agag. This is a quick rundown of what we're at now. So Samuel was upset with Saul because God had told Saul through Samuel that, you should take out all of these people when he came there. And he hacked King Agag to death. So that sin that Saul and the disobedience that Saul had performed there was just totally not what God wanted. And so we see the effects of that sin of Saul all the way down. This is 600 years later that's falling on Mordecai. It's the effects of it. Mordecai did not sin, but his forefather did. So things are going to get this problem is going to be solved here in the book of Esther. We made it up to Esther chapter 4. Haman was promoted, and Haman has enticed the king to make a decree to kill all of the Jews. Something that we've seen in recent history, if you're 80 years ago or so. And Mordecai has found out about that, and Mordecai is out in the streets. He's ripped his clothes. He's walking around. Esther, his cousin, looks out and sees her cousin out there in sackcloth and ashes, mourning, but she doesn't know. We're going to start in the first verse of chapter 4, even though we had moved up until like the 8th verse. I wanted to make sure that we covered chapter 4 properly, okay? It says, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, and that was Haman having the king sign the decree with his signet ring, that all the Jews should be killed. When Mordecai learned all that, verse 1, that what he had done, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city and wailed loudly and bitterly. So Mordecai, being the cousin of Esther, and he's also, as you've seen in previous verses that he would sit in the gate. So more than likely, it doesn't say it, but he was probably some sort of judge or magistrate. Whenever the Persians became in charge of the known world at that time, they didn't do what the Assyrians or the Babylonians did. They kind of integrated all the conquered peoples into their provinces. They even let 60, 80 years prior to this, they even let some of the Jewish folks go back to Jerusalem. Remember, the Babylonians had conquered them and then just burnt up Jerusalem, tore down the temple. Let them go back and reconstruct the temple area. So the Persians, up to this point, have been good. Okay? Verse 2, he went as far as the king's gate, for no one was to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. Okay, that's understood. Verse 3, in each and every province where the command and decree of the king came, there was a great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay on sackcloth and ashes. Do we remember who the queen is at this point? It's Mordecai's cousin. She is Jewish. She has not revealed that to the king yet. But he just signed a decree for all the Jews to be killed. Of course, whenever you look at the way that Mordecai had told them, he didn't say the Jewish people. There's a people that's not bowing down and worshiping. He didn't identify them. And regardless, he still doesn't know where Esther came from. Then Esther's maidens and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen writhed in great anguish, and she sent garments to clothe Mordecai, her cousin. It'd be probably also proper to say uncle, but he was her cousin because he did raise her from a child up to adulthood, that he might remove his sackcloth from him, but he did not accept them. Then Esther summoned Haman, the king's eunuchs, whom the king had appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. So Esther wants these eunuchs. Let me ask you a question, and I haven't really talked about this. Throughout Esther, we see a lot of eunuchs hanging around the harems. Okay, why is that? He can't trust the eunuchs. They weren't able to have relations with women. Okay, they were eunuchs. So the king had a group of eunuchs in his fold, I guess, that would take care of the women, but they wouldn't be able to do anything. Okay, thought I'd mention that. It's in the Bible, okay? So Haman went out to Mordecai in the city square in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. And that's back in chapter 3. It was a large sum of money, but if we look at it literally, it was about 1/3 of the amount of money that the whole nation of Persia was worth. But where would Haman get that money? That's the thing. The people he killed. Okay, there was a time they rolled the dice, or the PUR, the P-U-R, and they came up with a day, which is about 10, 11 months from this happening. Okay, he also gave him a copy of the text of the edict which had been issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show Esther and inform her. So Esther doesn't know yet. Mordecai just gave a copy to Haman to take it back to Esther to show him, and to order her to go into the king to implore his favor and to plead with him for her people. So where it says order Esther, remember who Mordecai was. He was just a judge in the gate. He's mourning this. Esther is actually the queen, but Esther always listened to Mordecai because He was like a father figure to her. He raised her. Okay. Hathach came back and related Mordecai's words to Esther. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the peoples of the king's provinces know, for any man or woman who comes to the king to the inner court, who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter, so that he might live. Let me explain that. You guys probably might already know, but if the queen automatically just goes into the king, she has not been invited, or anybody goes into the king and she has not been invited by that king, the law was that they be put to death. They haven't been summoned. They haven't been, the king has not wanted to see them unless he holds out the golden scepter and they touch the end of it. That sort of reminds me of something. I got to make sure that I don't lose my place here anymore. That sort of reminds me of how in the Old Testament, whenever the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies, he was only supposed to go in there once every year, right? But if anyone would, thank you, but if anyone during that year would go into that inner part of the temple, the Jewish temple, into the Holy of Holies, where God's presence was, they would die automatically. Guess what happened whenever Christ was crucified on the cross? That holy scepter was put out for everybody that wants to believe in him. That's where we can see things happening in this book that we, just reading it, you can't really notice things like that. We're talking about King Ahasuerus here, better known in history as Xerxes, but God has made a little picture right there of what his kingdom is like. That golden scepter is out for all of us, to those who believe. Okay. We were in verse 12, I believe. So, they related Esther's words to Mordecai. I'm going to go back to verse 12, all the way back to verse 12. That's a long verse, but we'll read it. Or 11. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king into the inner court who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death unless the scepter, that he holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. So they related Esther's words to Mordecai. Let's look at these verses here. These are some very important verses. Verse 13 and verse 14. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews." So Mordecai is saying, hey, look, you're a Jew. You're not going to escape. The law is that all the Jews will be killed. You're not any better than anybody else. You may be the queen, but whatever the king says now, or whatever this edict is, it will be taken place. Even if the king don't like it, he's already put his signet ring on it. He's already signed it. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your houses, your father's house, will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. If you're telling me that God is not in this book, his name is not in this book, this is almost like what happened with Joseph and his brothers whenever he was beaten by his brothers, thrown in a pit. Then they sold him into slavery. He's in Potiphar's house, interprets dreams, becomes second in command of Egypt, Remember, all this comes from whenever his brothers beat him and sold him into slavery. Now he's second in the command in Egypt, and there was a famine in the land, part of the dreams that he interpreted. The house of Jacob,
And who needed him?
his brothers needed him because that famine was not only in the land of Egypt, but it was right up there north and east of Egypt in the land of where Jacob was living. And so he sent his sons down to find grain to make food. Well, guess who gives them the grain? The brother that they had beaten. They were, whenever all was said and done, and Joseph had revealed himself to them, some of the most beautiful verses in the Bible, they were afraid. And what did Joseph say? Joseph said, you did this for evil, but God made it good. It was done for a purpose. Okay? That was also a picture of Jesus, if you haven't found out already. Because whenever Jesus came, his brothers rejected him. They beat him. They hung him on a cross. They put him in a grave for 3 days and 3 nights. They did that for evil. But what did God do it for? For the whole world. Okay. I'm glad I had that verse marked in my Bible. It's in yellow. So key part of that is do not imagine that you, in verse 13, you and the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. Mordecai knows the promises of God. It doesn't say it specifically here. He knows that this nation is going to survive no matter what. And he was just thinking, okay, that's probably why my cousin Esther is the queen of Persia right now. If she doesn't help, it's going to come from somewhere else. And then he tells her, and who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. Verse 15, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink. Hold on. Some other things not mentioned in the book was prayer. So right now we see Esther tell the people to fast. What's one of the things that goes hand in hand with fasting in the Bible? Old and new. Prayer and fasting. It's there. It's there. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. That sounds familiar. And my maidens also will fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. She's going to break the law to go see this king. If he doesn't hold out that scepter. Well, actually, she says it right here. Okay, let me read it. Yeah, go ahead and read it, Lisa.
And if I perish, I perish.
If
Basically, she's like, I'll do it no matter what. If I die, I die.
she's a beautiful lady.
She's like,
Did I tell you that her name in the first few verses of the book, her Jewish name was Hadassah? I told you it meant myrtle, and her Persian name was Esther, which means star. But did you guys know that the myrtle tree from that part of the world, when it had little blossoms of flowers that were starbursts? So there you go. God's working his fingers all over this book. Some people say, hey, or I say Esther is the star of this book. Some people say, well, no, it's God. Well, yeah, that's true too. He's using Esther. He's using Miss Star here. So Mordecai went away and did just as Esther had commanded him. Let me read that last verse, verse 16, or that next to the last verse. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. Okay. We already read 17. Now it came to pass, chapter 5 and verse 1. Let me check my time. Oh, it's 10:10, right? Chapter 5 and verse 1. Let's remember, guys, and we're not there yet, and I don't know if we're going to get there, that whenever Mordecai had told of the plot to kill the king found out, and he recorded it in the Chronicles. Let's remember that, okay? That was a couple chapters back. And we're going to see, what's that saying that we always say, George? God is behind the scenes, but he moves all the scenes that he's behind. Okay, that's the book of Esther. Now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's rooms, and the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. Okay, here we go. If I perish, I perish. When the king saw Esther, the queen standing in the court, she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. She lives. So Esther came near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, "What is troubling you, Queen Esther? And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be given to you." That's pretty tough there. Not only did he raise the scepter, he said, "What's troubling you? Ask me. I'll give you anything that you want, up to half of the kingdom." How big was this kingdom? It's in the first verse of the first chapter. 127 provinces. It stretched from India all the way to northern Africa and Ethiopia, and I'm not sure what it looked like then or how but I Googled it, how many countries was it, and it would have been 31 modern countries that the only place that they couldn't conquer at this time. Yes, the only place that they couldn't conquer at this time, which we will see in about 100 years from now, was Greece. Now, between chapters 1 and 2, there was a great battle, and that was the Battle of Thermopylae, and that was against the Greece, but the Greeks might have lost the war, but they turned Ahasuerus back. Okay, where was I at there? I was in chapter 5. Okay. Okay, he gave her half the kingdom. Okay, Esther said, "If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Remember who Haman was, and you can say boo, boo. Yes. Haman is the one that devised the plot to kill all the Jews. Esther is a Jew. The king loves Esther, and they're about to eat together. He just offered half the kingdom, up to half the kingdom to her, but he does not know yet that she is Jewish. Remember, I told you a couple of weeks ago that the Jewish historian from the first century, he was actually a Roman. He worked for the Roman government, but he was a Jewish historian. Flavius Josephus wrote about Esther. How did he know about Esther? Because this was like 500 years after he did. He wrote that she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Okay. Verse 5, then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that we may do as Esther desires." I can see things happening. The chessboard, God is the master chess player here, right? Like Bobby Fischer from the 60s and 70s. So he's the master chef, chess player. Came to the banquet. Okay, Esther that we may do as Esther desires. So the king sent for Haman. Came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. Verse 6. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? For it shall be granted to you." Okay. I want to see if we got enough time to go to what 10:15. We're good. Okay. Things are about to roll. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, remember Haman's here, right? "What is your petition? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of the kingdom it shall be done." So Esther replied, "My petition and my request is," and remember, she asked for Haman to be there, "if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and to do what I request, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says." Okay, I got ahead of myself. So it's going to be tomorrow. Verse 9. Then Haman went out that day glad and pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai, okay, here we go, in the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. So we see that there's going to be the meeting tomorrow between Esther, Haman, and the king. Haman leaves, sees Mordecai. Mordecai doesn't bow. And Haman is mad. Remember the last chapter it said he was an Agagite, Haman. Haman controlled himself, however, went to his house and sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman recounted to them the glory of his riches and the number of his sons, and every instance where the king had magnified him, and how he had promoted him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman's at his own house, and he's bragging about how big and how strong he's been promoted. He's second in command of Persia. He is all of that and a bag of chips put together. Haman also said, "Even Esther, the queen, let no one but me come to the king to the banquet which she has prepared." He doesn't know she's Jewish either. "And tomorrow also I am invited by her with the king. Yet all of this does not satisfy me. Every time I see that Mordecai, the Jew, sitting at the king's gate, then Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, have a gallows 50 cubits high. A cubit, about 18 inches. This is about 75 feet. Pretty tall. 50 cubits high, made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the banquet." Haman's got the plan. He is in there. And the advice pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. Haman is locked in. He knows what he wants to do now. He's gonna hang Mordecai on these gallows. Probably not the word that should be translated there. Gallows. We're not talking about a hanging with a noose and a rope. This is more like a big, tall stake in the ground, and whenever they hang somebody, they're going to impale them. As far as what I'm reading in some of the original, what you might find in the original manuscripts. Does anybody have a study Bible that might? Okay, we'll go ahead. We'll keep going here. So Haman is locked. You got to. Does it say anything about the kind of gallows that they're? Okay, it's more like impalement. Now, I don't know how they did it. If they do it on the ground or drop above, I don't know. We don't know. But Haman has constructed these, we'll just go with what the language says here, gallows. It's not going to be a rope, though, I can tell you that. So, Haman is locked in. He's got a plan like Stan. Tomorrow, he's going to go to the king. He's going to have Mordecai hung. He's going to have a banquet with the king and the queen. Okay, locked in, 75 feet. Okay, chapter 6, we're moving right along. During that night, the king could not sleep. Oh no, the king could not sleep. I've mentioned a couple of times what happened whenever Mordecai had reported on the plot to kill the king, right? Because I want to do that so we can keep that fresh in our minds. Because the king did not recognize Mordecai at the time. He said, there's a plot? Oh, okay. And he took the guys and hung them. That was all we heard of that. During that night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. It was a bedtime story, that's right. But remember what was written in that book of Chronicles? Mordecai had uncovered the plot, and he's the reason you're alive. Okay. It was found written that Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who were doorkeepers, that they had sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. So the king couldn't sleep. He orders the Chronicles to be brought in to read. It's sort of like, if you're trying to go to sleep, you would start reading a book or, watching a movie or something, and you go to sleep. The king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? So the king is saying, hey, what have we done for Mordecai? He has saved my life. Apparently, nothing has been done for Mordecai. Then the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. Verse 4, so the king said, who is in the court? So the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai. So remember, Haman's coming in. He's about to talk to the king about hanging Mordecai on the 75-foot wooden stakes. But the king has just read that Mordecai is the one that saved his life. So let me start that verse over. So the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. The king's servant said to him, behold, Haman is standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. Remember, Haman and the king they're bros now. They're best friends, okay? So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? I bet you Haman was thinking it was him that the king wanted to honor. And Haman said to himself, whom would the king desire to honor more than me? Then Haman, said to the king, for the man whom the king desires to honor. Then Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king desires to honor, let them bring a royal robe which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been placed. And let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. Haman knows how to honor a man. but it's the man that he wants to kill. It's the man that he wants to place on those gallows. Haman must honor. Okay, here we go. I was reading the heading in my Bible. Then the king said to Haman, take quickly the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so. For Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate, do not fall short in anything of all that you have said. I bet you Haman just had an accident. I don't know how to say it. So Haman took the robe and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city square and proclaimed before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home mourning with his head covered. Haman, he's now in sackcloth and ashes, has covered his head. He is upset, but let's remember, we haven't got to the banquet yet. We have not got to the banquet yet. What time is it? Oh. We're going to go ahead and finish this chapter. Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all of his friends everything that happened to that day. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. So his wife becomes a prophetess, says if this Mordecai is Jewish, and you've already commanded this law to kill all the Jews, you're going to die before he does, Haman. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. And we're going to stop it right there, because there's more to come. We see God's working in behind these scenes, and he's moving all the scenes that he's behind. God is the master chess player. He is Bobby Fischer. He's making the moves. And Haman, he had said check just a little while ago, but guess what God said? He said checkmate. But it's not over yet. It's not over that, because now we got to see what Esther has to say next week. We'll be in chapter 7. Okay, let us pray. God, we thank you for these words. Thank you, Father, for your story. We know your name's not in Esther, but we see your handprint, your fingerprints. We see you working throughout the book of Esther as you work behind the scenes in our lives sometimes very apparent behind the scenes and in front of the scenes as well. Blessed be the name of your Son, Jesus. In his name I pray. Amen. Chapter 7, next week.